My name is Jason Miles, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. And as I've been saying for the last few Sundays, we're switching it up on Sunday. And we are going to be doing something a little different. We are going to be having some shows under the moniker of TIR Presents. This is Revolution Presents. And the second Sunday of the month is Masha and the Bears. It's our good friend who was part of the original foreign policy crew with Kuba Rizniski, Dejin Bajlan. And her show is going to be a bit of a deeper dive academic take on foreign policy. In this episode, she talks about the possibility of a new Cold War in China. Ooh. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Maria Repnikova. She is a scholar of global communication with a comparative focus on China and Russia. Her research examines the processes of political resistance and persuasion in illiberal political contexts, drawing on ethnographic research approaches and extensive time in the field. Maria holds a doctorate from Oxford, where she was a Rhodes Scholar. She speaks fluent Mandarin, Russian, and Spanish. She teaches international communication, Chinese media, politics and society, and communication in global context at Georgia State University. And wherever you are listening to this, there are links in the description to Maria's Twitter. You know, just giving you some background context on what we're doing here. So Maria had a couple people on the show. She had Tapita Chow. Tapita is a director of justice, is a global and frequent. She's a director of justice, is global and a frequent commentator on all things China. And Zifan Yang, a China correspondent for Germany's Die Zeit magazine. And these guys took a deep dive into the possibility of a new Cold War, even though I recently saw President Joe Biden trying to say there's no Cold War with China. I'm not buying it. China is the world's second largest economy. It's reshaping the global order through the Belt and Road Initiative. Does that scare the hegemonic powers of the West? Yes, of course it does. But I'm not going to sit here and try to give you my 5-cent analysis when you have an hour and a half of some very hard-hitting scholarship that takes the deep dive into China. Also, keep an ear out for another episode we did that will be airing on Monday. So as you listen to this on Sunday, tomorrow, I'll be dropping the audio only for our birth control in modern China and the history of the one-child policy. We'll be taking a deep dive into that, and I made a very entertaining video. If you want to see this video, these intro videos that I spent so many hours making, creating the music for your chuckles. YouTube.com/This is Revolution Podcast. If you want to get that bonus after hour stuff. We just did one of our bigger shows, this conversation we had about the Dave Chappelle special. If you want to hear the after hours, because now we're doing call-ins. So if you want to call in and give us your 2 cents, the best way to do it, become a patron. Patreon.com/BitterLakePresents, and you get all the extra content. And depending on what level you are, you can get a hoodie and a coffee mug and something else I can't remember. But wherever you're listening to this, there are links in the description to the YouTube and the Patreon and our Twitch. We're going to be doing special streams on Twitch coming up with Jean Bajlan and the Derek Varn. There's some great stuff coming up with Pascal and I, and even Marcus of the Left Flank Vets, doing some stuff on Zero Books. And there's even more stuff I can't even mention right now that I'm very excited about. So we're busy. We're constantly trying to create more great stuff. If you have the means and you would like to support, then yes, please become a patron. At the very least, please just subscribe to the YouTube and share it with your people. So stay tuned for someone I'm very proud to call a friend, Maria Repnikova, Masha and the Bears, taking a deep dive on the reality of a new Cold War with China. You hear that music? That means I gotta shut up now. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next Sunday. Peace. Oh, I lied. I'll see you tomorrow.
Okay, we're gonna try this again. I apologize for the brief technical error. There was a crazy echo and maybe some interference from some sabotage powers out there. Welcome to Masha and the Bears, a monthly show where we discuss global affairs from a progressive internationalist perspective. Before we begin, I would like to remind you to like and subscribe, hit the bell, and I would like to let you know that Masha and the Bears will now be available as a podcast through This is Revolution on Sunday evening. So this week we'll be tackling the so-called New Cold War. China, the world's second largest economy, that is now reshaping the global order through projects like the PRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, is a subject of major scrutiny and controversy in the West. In particular, the political narrative in the US, in Europe, and across liberal democracies tends to focus on China as a competitor and even an enemy. In today's show, we take on the prevalent critiques of China and the dangers of deepening the anti-China sentiment for resolving critical issues like climate change. We get into and evaluate the key fears associated with China in America and in Europe, whether these fears are realistic, and what they tell us about the state of democracy in the West. So let's play the first clip. Okay, it seems like there's something wrong with our clips and our technology. We're going to really rely more on the conversation itself. So let's try this one more time.
The president's approach to China has been backwards. My concern from the beginning, I've spoke about it, and I met with Xi more times than anybody had up until the time we left office that I'm aware of, is to make it real clear to China. There are international rules that if you want to play by, we'll play with you. If you don't, we're not going to play, number one. Number two, it's not about punishing them for the COVID virus. It's about insisting that there be international norms that are established that they play by.
Okay, so since this clip was out, it's a little bit dated, but I think the narrative has really remained the same when it comes to Biden's policy and discourse about China. We had some news with Pentagon's first chief software officer, Nicholas Challan, resigning in protest against the slow pace of technological transformation in the US military. He said the failure to respond was putting the United States at risk, and that China is already winning this technological war when it comes to its prowess in developing tech industries and sabotaging potentially the future of US military power. So to help us untangle some of these issues and really get into the depth of these debates from various perspectives, today we're very delighted and excited to have two amazing guests with us. The first guest is Xifang Yang. She's a China correspondent for Germany's Die Zeit since 2018, but she also has a rich experience of covering China for nearly a decade. She's joining us from Beijing today. Xifang is also the author of the book titled When the Carps Learn to Fly, which presents a rich account about upward social mobility in China through the story of her own family. Welcome to the show, Xifang. We're really excited to have you on with us.
Hi, Masha. I'm excited to be here today.
Our second guest today, who is going to complement and really enrich our discussion, is Toby Cho. He's the Director of Justice is Global and a frequent commentator on all things China and on how the left should constructively engage with the China policy. Both of these guests tonight offer much nuance and moral clarity in our thinking about China, and I'm delighted to have them both join us on the show. Hi, Toby. Welcome, and welcome again, Xifang.
Hi, glad to be here.
Great. So let's start from the beginning. You know, both of you have watched this really brief clip and have heard me talk about the latest news about this resignation in the government. But of course, there are many other similar discussions taking place in Washington and some in Europe as well. So the first broader question I wanted to open up with is there really a new Cold War? And how is the China policy formulated between, the US and Germany? So I'm going to go to Toby first and ask you to briefly comment on how do you see Biden's China policy evolving? Is there something different from the Trump era? What's the overarching kind of narrative, if you could describe it in a few sentences? How should we think about China policy under Biden?
So starting with under Trump and Trump's announcement of the trade war in 2018, the U.S. has been set on a path of a long-term escalating tensions and conflict with China. I would call it like a great power rivalry. The label "new Cold War," I have some like doubts if that's the most useful term that we should use as critics of this dynamic. I think there are important places where the analogy breaks down, and also apparently the foreign policy establishment in the U.S. Thinks the Cold War ended really well, like it was a success story, and like only good things happened. So in terms of like raising tensions as a term of critique of the foreign policy establishment, maybe it's like not effective for that reason. They hear it say, "Yeah, Cold War, that was great.
Let's do this one more time." Yeah.
Why not? I think it's fundamentally about a couple of things. One is that the ruling class in the U.S. has this ideological attachment to maintaining U.S. supremacy and domination over the entire rest of the world. And the rise of China is a genuine threat to global U.S. power. Another part of the dynamic that I think is really important is that ever since the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, the global economy has been quite weak, and global economic growth has been anemic. And that has led to a dynamic of zero-sum competition between a lot of countries, but the most important such competitions between the US and China, where the sense that the space in the global economy is shrinking, is forcing them, is creating pressure on both sides to enter into this spirit of zero-sum competition, where like in order for one to prosper, the other has to suffer. And that mindset is, it's been building for a while, but with the start of the Trump's trade war in 2018, it really started to set in and solidify. And I think the Biden administration has overall really kept us on that path in U.S. policy towards China. And to legitimize this overall anti-China strategy, a lot of sort of principles get invoked. One is this idea of international norms, and the rules-based order is a term that is very popular under the Biden administration. The idea that the U.S. is upholding this rules-based order and China is a threat to it. Also, a lot of very legitimate critiques of China around human rights issues and threats towards Taiwan get invoked, and those are legitimate critiques. But I think at the end of the day, the main driving force is this ideological commitment to maintaining U.S. power around the world.
Yeah, thank you so much, Toby. It's a wonderful summation of all these different trends and forces behind the latest rhetoric, and maybe how we're not shifting that far away from the Trump era when it comes to China policy. I want to turn to Xifan next. In Germany, there was just a major election, and I'm curious to hear from you, to what extent China has played a part or was a kind of a card in this election. Did people talk about it? Did politicians invoke China? Is it the same way that China gets talked about in the US in very antagonistic terms, or is it more absent? So would love to hear how your views maybe contrast or enrich or contradict some of the things that Toby just mentioned about the US.
I think one of the most baffling things about the German election campaign is that we had three major TV debates between the three competing candidates for chancellor. It's the first time that we had three candidates, not two. And yeah, the most baffling thing was that China was not raised once in those three debates. And there were other major like TV interviews, discussions, like talk shows, and China just barely ever got mentioned at all. To be fair, I would need to say that foreign policy didn't play a major role in the election campaign to begin with, which is quite, I would even say shocking when you think about that Germany is the biggest economy in Europe, and that all eyes were on Germany because like the whole of Europe is expecting Germany to take the lead, especially when these days in Brussels, everyone is talking about strategic autonomy, but no one knows what this actually is supposed to mean. And Germany, along with France, are expected of define that strategy Germany has been under Merkel. It's interesting, the perception of Angela Merkel's politics is quite different in Germany compared to the praise she gets and her very good reputation outside Germany. I think I do respect Angela Merkel a lot, and for sure she has been one of the very few politicians out there on international stage in the past years, but that was only because the competition for the bar a lot in recent years. So, but Angela Merkel didn't really how do you say, she was not really shaping like a foreign policy, a distinct foreign policy strategy in the past years, especially when it comes to China. She a lot of people say she got kind of like stuck in that Hu Jintao era still. Like first when she started out, that was in 2005. I mean, it's crazy, but she has been reigning for 16 years. And when she set out, she was very critical when she set out, because she grew up under the DDR, in the DDR, which is like the Eastern Germany regime. And so she was very critical to begin with towards China. Then when the years went by, she realized, China is this very dynamic place. She got really interested in the development. Went to China once a year, which is quite rare. And she kind of began to saw China as an opportunity. Also, I think it was just pure pragmatism. She realized that, of course, the big companies do rely on the Chinese market. And as the years went by, and Xi Jinping just broke with a lot of the paradigms of his predecessors, she somehow got stuck. Or maybe she was tired. One doesn't know. She was one crisis after another, like Ukraine, Euro crisis, then refugee crisis. Then she didn't want to stick around for her last term. She only did so because Trump was elected, right? So I think maybe in the end she just got a little bit tired. That's why Europe now, and especially Germany, is behind the curve on many things when it comes to China. And also the genesis of like the German attitude or the European attitude towards China is a little bit different than in the US, because you were just talking about the zero-sum game after the financial crisis. And Germany was very much different, because Germany, together with China, got through the financial crisis actually pretty well. The exports didn't suffer so much. And then afterwards, as I already mentioned, Germany was very much occupied with the Euro crisis, the debt crisis in Greece, then the Russian invasion in the Ukraine, then the refugee crisis, and the Syrian war from 2015 on. So I think when China really started to become a major topic in the public debate, that was 2017, 2018. I think the first time the Germans really realized there was something such as the Belt and Road Initiative. I remember it was 2017, 18. That was like 5 years after the initiative got started. So
it's a long time.
It's a very long time. As I said,
it's almost like they were asleep and then they somehow
behind the curve in the China debate. So exactly, and waking up, but too quickly. And I talked to some politicians in the Liberal Party, in the Green Party, also in the Social Democratic Party. Those three parties are supposed to form the new traffic light coalitions, and there are very smart people there who realize that China must be on the top agenda, but they don't speak for the majority of the politicians in Germany. So we will really to see whether Germany is actually going to wake up. in the future.
So it's a fascinating,
it's
a fascinating contrast with the U.S., right? Kind of the slow waking up, but also very different economic forces. The lack of this impetus that we see in the U.S., the zero-sum game narrative is absent. But shifting a bit from the kind of the leadership and the high politics perspective to society, I think we've seen in the United States that there's been an evolution of kind of China-watching community across different, party lines and political spectrums, and just a lot of people are kind of engaged in different ways in China, including some of our viewers, right, that are interested in thinking about China from this very distinct and sometimes contradictory perspectives. What do we think about this major power? How do we think about its human rights abuses versus economic growth versus modeling some of its success after and so forth? So I wanted to kind of turn to the societal views a little bit. So going back to Toby, how do you see this evolution of China watching community in the US playing out? Is it much more kind of diverse and active and dynamic now, or do we see sort of a more of a merging of the same opinions, coming across different spectrums? Like, how would you characterize the overcast, kind of societal watching community, from think tanks to just broader public, social media? What's your take on this, having done this for so many years?
Yeah, I still see myself as kind of an outsider to the China watcher community in the US, and sometimes it can feel pretty alienating. But the major strands that I see are first, people coming out of like the foreign policy establishment and just sort of giving voice to U.S. foreign policy goals. And the U.S. foreign policy establishment is very much bipartisan. You don't see a lot of difference between Democratic Party and Republican Party on a lot of like key foreign policy issues, and China is no exception there. As foreign policy establishment, the business world is another major source of China watchers, and so I see a lot of people giving voice to some of the aspirations that like business investors have in China, or anxieties that they have around the recent crackdowns on business that we've seen from the Chinese government. Another major strand is like human rights advocates. So the folks that I know who do human rights work on China, I think are like very genuinely concerned about these issues, and I think rightly so. There is, however, an overall tendency for these human rights issues to get instrumentalized for like U.S. foreign policy purposes that are fundamentally about preserving U.S. power. And a lot of the people who do human rights work are like aware of this dynamic and like trying to navigate it. And then of course there's like journalists who work on China, but I feel like the major strands of conversation that I see are like foreign policy establishment, business, and human rights work. And that's sort of the mix. Yeah.
Different mix of the issue areas, and I guess the actors in according to what those issues are supporting or resisting or providing certain views. What about Germany? If we turn to Germany, Stefan, you talked about this kind of waking up, the slow awakening, and also the fact that China really wasn't mentioned at all in the election, but Merkel did start to create this or adopt this pragmatic attitude vis-a-vis China. Is there an active community of China watchers in Germany, and who are they? We don't know much about them here in the US, but is it a very lively space? How has it evolved in recent years? Who is watching and commenting on China?
I think probably the most well-known institution also beyond the German borders is MERIX, the Mercator Institute for China Studies, who they have very, very good experts. It's the biggest China think in Europe, and they do very admirable work. Beyond that, I was recently invited to a party in Berlin, like a China watching party.
Sounds like fun.
Hosted by a fellow journalist friend of mine. I think we were around 15, 20 people, and probably there was already half of the China watching community in Germany.
Very tight community.
Yeah, very, very tight community. Like some of the American outlets until recently, until unfortunately all the colleagues by the New York Times and the Washington Post and a big share of the Wall Street Journal journalists in China got kicked out. Like, for example, the New York Times, they had more than 12 correspondents here, like a huge office in Beijing. Most of the German and European outlets only have one or two journalists in China, which is not nearly enough to cover this huge country. And most of the time, we are also Asia correspondents, like if there's such a generic thing as Asia. So we really have a lot of limited resources and China competence. I was telling you about the smart people in the parties, political parties who realize that something needs to be done. That is also, I think that is like the prerequisite for anything China that you want to talk about, to have people who have the expertise, and that is what's missing in Germany. One number, and that is very striking, is that there are less people studying Chinese in universities than studying Korean and Japan studies. I think there are only 500 students in Germany right now. I'm studying, starting sinology every year. 500 in the middle. 500. And in the middle schools, there are more people studying ancient Greek than studying Mandarin.
Wow, that's an interesting occupation. Yeah, very practical. Yeah.
But I would say also like a big major missing factor in Germany when it comes to China expertise is we do miss the immigrant community. Right? In the US, you have probably millions of people with Chinese roots or with immigrant background. We don't have that in Germany. So there is really, really a lot to do. When talking about the ideological spectrum, I would say it's not as polarized in the US, probably. We do have some old hippie-ish lefties, techies, who used to wave the Red Mao Bible in the 70s and are still very stuck in this kind of very, very classic techie mindsets. Then we have more and more people who are turning more hawkish, but I don't see that blatant China is an enemy kind of as prevalent as in the US. Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting about the number of students also studying Chinese. Like, I don't know how many are studying Chinese now in the US. Maybe Toby, you have some idea of these numbers. I don't quite have the scale in my mind, but I just read recent articles that there are fewer students studying Chinese because they're not getting the lucrative jobs they were hoping for. They were hoping to make money, become rich. So Chinese was supposed to be this channel towards richness, but that didn't quite work out. So they ended up, dropping this difficult endeavor and doing something else. So I guess it was supposed to be kind of an entrepreneurial money-making mechanism. So, but I guess the numbers are much higher here, but I'm not sure if they're rising, but or flattening out, because it's just so hard to learn Chinese and be fluent in it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, I omitted an important part of the China watcher world in the US, which is just like these far right reactionaries, like sort of from the Trumpist wing of the Republican Party. And there's this whole infrastructure like around Epoch Times and this guy Miles Guo and Steve Bannon and stuff like that. And you get into stuff that's like very much about conspiracy theories around and scapegoating China for like absolutely everything. So that's a pretty extreme part of like China watching, but I think it's unfortunately an increasingly important part of the discourse, and increasingly influential on the mainstream right as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting, thought in terms of just the use or the invocation of China by these different groups, especially the right-wing groups. What are they trying to accomplish by invoking China, which kind of leads me to the question in terms of scapegoating, the idea of using or invoking China as an enemy. To what extent is it a reflection of us, as a system, especially in the US, where we're becoming so divided, so polarized? What does China really mean? It's not really about China, it's about us. So what's this invocation really telling us about the state of our own politics here? And I guess, given that Germany doesn't seem to experience as much polarization, maybe China is seen as less of a scapegoat, or there are other scapegoats in Germany. So I'm curious to hear from you first, Toby. Do you see China as becoming increasingly a scapegoat? And if so, is it mostly used by the right, or do we see it being used by all actors in their own, for their own agendas?
Yeah, I think China does get used as a scapegoat across the political spectrum, but the leading force is really on the right. It's the right that puts out the most aggressive and extreme narratives, and I think ultimately ends up sort of leading and can sort of they've gotten themselves into a position where they can sort of play a role in setting narratives that then bleed over towards the liberal end of the political spectrum, which I think is a very worrying dynamic. And like you said, this is a lot of this stuff, or I would say like the majority of it, is not so much about China as it is about breakdowns in how Americans understand America. All of these internal problems or crises or failings of American society and the US political system get projected onto China, and China gets turned into sort of the boogeyman, and the way for Americans to avoid reckoning with the failures that are internal to US society, right? So a couple examples of how this plays out, and again, this can happen across the political spectrum, but it's more common and more extreme on the right. People will say like the greatest threat to the U.S. way of life or American democracy, the greatest authoritarian threat to the U.S. is China. When if you look at what's happening in U.S. politics, the threats to U.S. democracy and like a democratic American way of life is coming from within the U.S. and in fact, it's coming from the same far right elements that are also promoting these narratives that turn China into the scapegoat for authoritarianism. Another way we see this is we see Republicans increasingly pointing the finger at China as like the biggest threat to American workers. Meanwhile, these are also politicians that are doing the bidding of U.S. corporations to attack workers' rights, to try to block increases in the minimum wage, to block the pro-worker elements of President Biden's agenda, which there's actually significant pro-worker measures that Biden has proposed as part of his agenda, and it's being sabotaged by these right-wing actors that then get to pose as if they are champions of the U.S. worker by being anti-China, saying that China is the cause of all the problems for working-class Americans, when it's actually them and politicians like them in concert with corporate America.
Right. So it's a very convenient distraction because it seems to unify people and galvanize them, and they're blind to the actual dysfunctioning of the system and don't blame the right actors, right? Don't frame the right responsibility on the right players, the right actors, which are actually the companies allied with the government officials here. Is there something similar happening in Germany, Stefan, or is there kind of this more quieter, maybe repressed or not very evident sentiment when it comes to scapegoating of China? Is it seen as used as a scapegoat much, or not really?
I will come back to that point in a second. I just want to add one more point to what Toby just said. In fact, the tariffs, I remember reading something just a few days ago, the tariffs did not lead to any jobs, white-collar jobs, returning to the US, right? In fact, the tariffs just added on the consumer costs for most Americans. And I think they majorly failed to achieve what they were supposed to. No?
Yeah, that's right. Before the pandemic hit, they triggered a manufacturing recession. There was a recession in the U.S. manufacturing sector that was triggered by the tariffs. So yeah, totally counterproductive on their own terms.
Yes, Ivan, do you want to go back to the point about this?
Yes, I want to go back to Germany. I do the reliance of especially big German companies like Volkswagen and Siemens are dangerous for German democracy, in a sense that we have seen in recent years German CEOs especially have started to self-censor themselves. For example, when it comes to Xinjiang, for example, Herbert Diess, the CEO of Volkswagen, pretended to not know anything about the camps in Xinjiang and the human rights repression there. We have seen Daimler self-censoring themselves when their social media team put on a Dalai Lama quote on Instagram and so on. And then there are people in academia, in China studies, when they collaborate with Confucius institutes, there are instances when they do self-censor, like sensitive terms, expressions in academic papers. And I think that is a very dangerous thing. However, that is not something that you cannot deal with when you just basically stand up for your... I mean, you don't have to self-censor yourself, right? So every company, every institution can draw the line for themselves if they want to, but the lure of Chinese money is very strong these days, of course. Mm-hmm. And you also have that in the US with NBA, and we have seen that with football clubs like Arsenal, London, all over Europe. I think that is... but that is also something more we have to debate internally, like where do we draw the lines as a society, and are companies obligated to represent our democratic values, or are politicians only obligated to represent economic interest when our political leaders fly to Europe? I think there is very much an imbalance there. Like every time when Angela Merkel flew to Beijing in the past 16 years, she would, there would be the photo ops where she, along with the German CEOs, would sign these contracts, and the politicians have the job to act in the interest of the German economy. But in return, there's like the CEOs, they kind of bow down to Chinese pressure every time a major issue comes up, and they always retreat to that phrase, business is business, right? And I think that cannot go on, and companies, German companies or Western companies, they have to ask themselves, do we also carry responsibility for the society where we originate from? Having said that, also in Germany, not to the extent as the political landscape is becoming more fractured. We also see how like misinformation spread on social media is undermining like the public debate. There's a general decline of public debate as well. We have a rising number of neo-Nazi violent attacks and neo-Nazi crime. And we also have a rising inequality that has not so much to do with white-collar jobs being lost to China, but more with just the general fact that there is very low taxation on the rich, and that it's more easy to become rich these days being a real estate or stock investor than actually doing just a regular job. So we have that kind of Fox News-ish right-wing debate on China as well. For example, our major news tabloid, Die Bild, the chief editor, he wrote something after the outbreak of COVID about that Xi Jinping, he wrote a letter to Xi Jinping that Xi Jinping needs to regulate like the bat soup restaurants out there. And I mean, I've never seen a bat restaurant in China ever. Nice. So we have those voices, but all in all, I think, and we have those notorious, like China Threat magazine covers where you see the angry dragon, and always the angry dragon, not an angry panda, right? But again, it is much more muted than in the US, luckily, and a majority of Germans think that, for example, the government needs to be more firm towards Beijing when it comes to human rights. But that I think is a good thing. Yeah, I think most Germans realize that you have to deal with China in some way, and then you cannot cut all the ties off.
So it's interesting, so many different, rich insights that Stefan, you're offering here. And I think the point on self-censorship and companies having to take a stance, or it's eventually having to have some sense of, I guess, national belonging, or having some kind of roots somewhere. They're not just after money or their own interests. Of course, that's a debate that's taking place, I think, globally. It's like, how do you balance that? And are companies ever going to be able to, or are going to be willing to actually address any of these tensions? And of course, it's not just companies. We're having the same debates here in the US, in universities, and across spectrum about where is the funding coming from? How do we balance the money with, what we say and act like around and about China? I wanted to ask Toby how you see this evolution of self-censorship, playing out in the US. Are you observing more and more of it over time when it comes to, talking about sensitive issues from different actors who are engaged in China debate? Or do you see this as primarily something that's really in the frontier of companies as opposed to, I don't know, universities or other individuals, mostly kind of corporate interests, or is it across spectrum? And is there really some hope there in terms of, moving forward, or is it just going to get worse? Because it seems like we're not seeing too much of a large scale pushback. How is this ever going to be fixed or addressed, right?
It's definitely going to get worse before it gets better. So there are two forces that different people have to deal with, right? So in the US, there's growing anti-Chinese nationalism, which can, or most frequently does go along with some kind of anti-Asian racism. Mm-hmm. And then within China, you have growing Chinese nationalism. So you do see multinational corporations. The NBA is like the high-profile example that Stefan mentioned, seeming to like censor themselves or tiptoe around human rights issues in China because of the value that they place on access to the consumer market in China. And I mean, this is corporations doing what they do. They'll do whatever they have to do to maximize their profits. That's the game that they play. Mm-hmm. I don't worry too much about that. More alarming is the impacts on academia, which I can't. You might know more about specific examples than I do, but there have been cases where U.S. academia where they're trying to maintain these partnerships or access to China, seemingly do censor themselves in order to avoid getting cracked down on the Chinese side by Chinese authorities. I think this has happened with like some academic presses or something like that.
Yeah, there's been a few examples with some academic journals and books. And in general, the debates around whether you want to reach a Chinese audience or not. Obviously, most of us, as an academic myself, we want to reach the audience, but also it comes at a cost. And just recently, I had a colleague reach out to me asking advice about, her book being translated to Chinese by Chinese publisher for, mainland China. They want to cut out like the ending and, change a few things, the title, and some things just kind of got a little mushed around, but the core content is still there. So it's a dilemma. Like, do you still publish? Do you want to reach that audience or not? And that's a very personal, I think, decision, but it's a difficult one.
Yeah. I've also heard from folks in like nonprofits, people that do like nonprofit work, NGO work in China. And, there's a dilemma, they're critical of a lot of the repressive policies in China. And there's a dilemma about like, well, do we continue to work here and really watch what we say so that we can try to do some good, sort of quietly, versus like, do we speak out publicly on this stuff but then that's going to risk our ability to continue to work in China. Right. So that's a real dilemma for them. Within the U.S. as well, though, like the growth of anti-Chinese nationalism, which again can take the form of anti-Asian racism, particularly if you are, someone like me who is of Chinese descent and is speaking up critically about this increasingly hawkish turn in U.S. foreign policy towards China that can make you vulnerable to attacks that you're not being patriotic enough, or like maybe you're a tool of the Chinese Communist Party. I know there are some like Chinatown community organizations, and like they're organizing working class communities in Chinatown, working class Chinese American communities that have been attacked by like right wing think tanks, like far right think tanks, and accused of being in league with the Chinese Communist Party. There are folks I've heard from who are trying to still work, within establishment think tanks or whatever, and they self-censor themselves. Like they have critical thoughts about the direction that U.S. policy towards China is taking, but particularly if they are of Chinese descent, they are worried about the consequences for themselves professionally if they speak out about this stuff. Yeah, like right now, I would say the pressures are much more intense from the side of Chinese nationalism, but within both countries, you see things on what I see as a very destructive trajectory. And I am genuinely worried about how bad it's going to get within the United States. I can see on the far right, people laying the groundwork for a combination of like anti-Asian racism with like Red Scare politics. I think they're laying the groundwork for that. And if they come back into power and things keep going down the road, with this current road, then I'm really worried that we could see a return of just some of the worst periods in U.S. history. And, I have concerns about whether the liberal establishment Democratic Party is actually going to have our backs on that.
Right. Yeah. Very uncertain future when it comes to this context here. Is there something, these kind of concerns that you share as well in Germany, Stefan, or is it different environment there?
I think I agree with Toby on many points, especially that it's harder for academia and for NGOs and like people in descent to deal with this challenge, especially if you're all your work is based in China, and you have to think about your visa and working restrictions. However, I have one idea when it comes to companies, and why no one has thought about that. Like, let's just play this mind game that let's imagine if all companies, all DAX companies, all the football clubs, if the NBA, if we all collectively decide to call Taiwan, to have Taiwan stay in the country list, and to speak out on Xinjiang, Hong Kong, or whatever. I mean, what really happened if we do that collective? Would China ban all football and all basketball and everything from Chinese TV? Would China ban all the foreign brands, all the foreign car manufacturers? It would just not be feasible. The malls would empty in China. Also, not only that, it would hit the Chinese job market because I think the German companies, the big German companies, they do employ more than 1 million Chinese locals in China. I don't know the number for American companies. But still, also when it comes to high tech and so on, much of what China produces is still produced by foreign companies or foreign joint ventures. So you cannot boycott just all the foreign companies. And I would be, it really happens. And I suppose maybe there would be a huge outcry, but if companies would be just a bit more brave in that regard, I do think the repercussions would be much, much less harmful than we would imagine.
So that's a very, it's a very interesting proposition. I'm curious, from Toby, as an organizer, someone whose work is to mobilize different forces together. How do you see this mobilizing work play out in reality? Is it feasible for companies to somehow be pushed to embrace that agenda collectively, not just one or two players, but really an array of different players coming together to do that?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm my immediate reaction is pessimistic. I think looking for courage from multinational corporations. I'm not hopeful about that. I think they just chase.
I'm not
profits.
hopeful about that either. I'm just saying that if they would, I think it would be an idea worth to try it out.
Yeah. Okay, but then the other half of this is that I worry about is how well organized nationalist forces within China are, and I think about the episode from earlier this year. Was it this year? Time under the pandemic is so weird. I don't know what happened what year anymore. But there was this online nationalist campaign within China about like I support Xinjiang cotton, and it was in reaction to reports about certain multinational garment companies having some statement about against like forced labor in their cotton supply or something like that in Xinjiang. And I don't know. I feel like that in reaction to that, there was a well-organized nationalist campaign that took place on Chinese social media. And it was like very popular. And the brands, the garment brands, then immediately retreated. So I don't know. I worry about how well organized so the nationalist reaction within China can be. And I don't know. That's something that I struggle with, like how, I care a lot about human rights issues in China. Like I know some people who've been imprisoned for activism or whatever, but the power of the nationalist reaction to any sort of advocacy that we lead from the West is something that I don't know how to like deal with that at a strategic level.
So I just want to add one fun point about that is yes, there was like nationalist outcry online, but much of what we see that shitstorm online does not translate into real life, because I heard from Adidas, their sales dropped, like after this campaign started, it dropped by 30% in the first week. After 1 month, the sales basically almost completely recovered. Then, because, after all, like people don't want to run around in like leaning shoes. They want to have like the Adidas Ultra Boost or like Yeezy or whatever. I think I read a very interesting thing about H&M was that, you didn't see anyone in the H&M stores for a couple of days, but then they had like a sale going on, like everything 50% off. And then people were like, I wanted to get that sweater for a long time. So basically then everyone rushed in, and then same with Nike. They had like a special sale going on after their stores were empty for a couple of days, and then people rush back. I mean, after all, like people, also, especially young people, they care much about like looking cool and making a great deal than really, just sticking to what nationalists tell them to do.
Yeah, it's interesting. All the online offline dynamic is always fascinating to observe how much of the online translates or doesn't translate into offline, which is, I guess, the same thing here in the US or anywhere else. But I wanted to shift us briefly into the dynamics of kind of collaboration and solidarity building across these two countries, but across, just globally, when we think about climate change is one of the major issues of our time that we keep hearing about and talking about and feeling frustrated about. And of course, it's impossible to resolve any of this without without collaborating at all with China. So I wanted to kind of turn to Toby first in terms of building these alliances or building some of these networks. I know you do some of this in your own work. Is there any space left to actually build some solidarity across China and the US? I'm not even talking about politicians, but just society, when we have such a heightened nationalism, as you said, both in China and the US, so much protectionism. How do you actually create those bridges, if at all? Or is it totally, again, hopeless? Are you pessimistic on this as well as on other things? Or is there some glimpses you can share of hope?
I do try to be hopeful despite my trenchant pessimism. I do think that there are opportunities. I think it is extremely difficult and has gotten so hard in recent years, particularly since I would say like 2018. The way that I initially got into US-China work was not anything having to do with foreign policy or anything, but it was around doing US-China labor solidarity and figuring out ways to bring workers organizing in China into relationship with working class people in the US and like union members and organizers. That was powerful and meaningful and just fantastic work while it lasted. But starting around 2018, it quickly became impossible. And that was mainly because of the escalating levels of crackdowns within China. it is dangerous to be any kind of activist that challenges the government in any way in China. And if you're collaborating with activists in the US, that just escalates the level of threat. So it's not really the sort of work that we can do anymore. So it's like really hard. I think, however, that there are opportunities to build some forms of solidarity and sort of keep that spirit alive. There's some work being done that I think is very important with Chinese international students. So one of the nice things about the current system is that maybe it's hard to go to China to meet folks there, but a lot of China comes here, and Chinese international students are a big form of that, and a lot of them come in and they have progressive ideas. They get involved with politics and social movements in the United States, and are like really interested in learning about like the labor movement here, about Black Lives Matter, about feminist organizing, all of these things, and these struggles that are very alive in the U.S. that they can relate to social problems that they see back in China. And so there are some networks trying to figure out how do we build solidarity with Chinese international students and use that as a place of building a form of transnational politics, even if actually going between the two countries and doing that work in that way is becoming increasingly challenging. I also think that when it comes to some of the key global challenges that we face, like the pandemic and like climate change, there are some opportunities to make common cause. And we can look at like ways that, at the state level, the US and China can work together. And on at least some of these issues, there's also maybe some opportunities in working through nonprofits. Like there are, despite all the crackdowns on civil society in China, there are some nonprofits in China that work on the environment and that work on climate. And they're very limited in what they can do, but I think there are some opportunities to do transnational work through civil society in that way. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. So some little cracks, whether it's students or some organizations or individuals. I wanted to turn to Sifan in terms of this question of, I guess, building some of these linkages. And when we think about China, in activism, of course, there's a significant crackdown, but also a lot of, I think, concern with environmental degradation within China. Lots of concern with pollution, all kinds of issues that young people and older people rally around on social media, at least, sometimes also offline. Does that at all translate into kind of larger awareness about climate change as a global issue and a desire to think about this across communities beyond China, or is it mostly seen as a China-specific, China-only kind of internal issue? How would you think about this kind of idea of environmental concern in China versus or connected to climate change activism or consciousness? Do you think there's such a thing in China or not so much?
I think there's more and more environmental concern. I don't think there's more and more climate change concern. For example, I think what was a major game changer was the 2014 documentary by former CCTV journalist Under the Dome, where she talked about the air pollution. And so what's on people's minds, especially the urban middle class, for the past years has been mostly clean air, clean water, and then more and more people are also aware of the use of plastic these days. But for example, in Beijing, we have seen, I think last year we had more than 250 days of clean skies, which was unimaginable just a couple of years ago. However, that does not mean that pollution does not still persist. They just moved out all the dirty factories to other provinces where they pollute people who are less in the middle of international tension. When it comes to climate change, I don't think there's much awareness yet. I have followed the Chinese Greta Thunberg, so to speak, Howie O or Hongyi. I've met her, very, very impressive girl. Oh, she turned 18, so I shouldn't say go. She turned 18 last year. She is somehow like a lone warrior, like climate activist. In China, started out, I think, in 2018 or 2019, like demonstrating in front of the provincial government, then also striking, doing like the Friday strikes. But all in all, during those 2 years, she only managed to gather a group of maybe a handful, not more than maybe 10 supporters. And when she traveled around China and she did her Friday demonstrations, I think all in all over China, she that maybe 100 people participated. She is much more well known in the West, of course, due to media coverage, than in China. And for example, she's connected to Luisa Neuberger, who the German greater, so to speak, who advises her a lot. She's very well connected with from all over the world. But in China, she is really very lonely in her activism. And shortly after she turned 18, she left the country. She now lives in Germany. Part of it is because of security reasons. The police and the authorities, they excluded her from school, but they were shying away from more like harsh measures against her because she was a minor, and her family was worried that this would change after she was 18. So now she's gone to Europe, if you just I don't see much discussion in China outside the environmental and the policy circles when it comes to use of coal. I don't see much discussion in China outside like urban, like more post-materialist circles when it comes to, or Buddhist circles when it comes to meat consumption, basically, or just in generally farming. When you look at the floods in Zhengzhou recently, that you had like more rainfall within 24 hours or within 2 hours than the whole last year. There's basically a very direct consequence of climate change. There was little mentioning of climate change as a factor behind the floods in state media. It is not that the Chinese government is not aware of climate change as a challenge. I do think that the upper level is very much aware. After all, they are a lot of Chinese elite educators are scientists and technocrats. They don't want the public debate because probably because they are afraid of too much bottom-up pressure, right? So Xi Jinping he has set a goal. We want to become climate neutral by 2060, and we want to hit the emission peak by 2030. How to achieve the path towards those goals are very murky at this point. No one knows how to achieve that, and I don't think the government at this point wants any pressure from society that urges them to just speed up.
Right. So that's leaves less hope for some kind of transnational work on these issues, but also, of course, we see all kinds of climate deniers, in the United States and around the world. Really, it's not just kind of something that Chinese society or government ignores, but we see a lot of these debates and turning into all kinds of radical ways as well here in the States.
Interestingly, there are not so many there are not many climate deniers in China. There's just basically little talk about it at all.
Yeah. I guess it's also just framing the environmental issues as more domestically kind of rooted or grounded, or it's about fixing them here as opposed to thinking about this as this global, crisis, the planet versus the country, which makes it hard to solve it, I guess, in the future.
Also, you have to take into account that it's hard to start up a debate how to cut down your consumption when for at least 600 or 800 million people in this country, what's on their mind is how to step out of poverty. And they're like, hey, we did not own a car yet. We want to live in a bigger house. Who are you to tell me?
Yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely. Yeah, that also comes into, I guess, a nationalist sentiment of just, pride of how far China has come and what it has accomplished on economic front, and being able to actually enjoy some of these benefits as opposed to trying to restrict yourself and say, well, I owe it to the world not to have this car or house or whatever else. So that from that perspective, it also is a sensible thing that it's not quite taking off as widely. So we're coming towards, the final couple of minutes, since we started a little late with a couple of weird glitches at the beginning. So apologies again for that. But kind of leaving a few final words in terms of moving forward on this China discussion, China debate. From your perspective as practitioners, I work in the academy and write about China from kind of abstract perspective as an academic, but coming in as a practitioner, engaging broader public as a journalist, as an activist, as an advocate. What do you think are some of the next steps we should be thinking about when it comes to organizing? And turning to Toby first, you mentioned a few things with international students. I was curious if you can give any specific examples of maybe how this community can be engaged more, worked with more constructively. Are there some channels or interesting initiatives you personally are engaged in? And I think you tell us a little bit about your own work and how that speaks to larger mission that you talk about, this building of solidarity and progressive activism across borders. Maybe some more concrete examples of, what are you up to these days in your own full-time job, and some interesting examples for us to think about and be inspired by. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, if folks are interested in Chinese international students specifically, there's a group called the Chinese Student Activist Network, Chinese Student and Activist Network. And they recently published the results of a survey they did with Chinese international students about sort of how they are becoming socially and politically engaged in their life here in the United States. It is unfortunately only in Chinese at the moment. It's being translated, but that version has not been published yet.
You have to speak Chinese to join that.
Yeah. I think Google Translate will do an okay job. Will give you the gist for sure. But so that's some like really cool work that's being done. I think another, there's like Shifan mentioned, there's a ton of obstacles here, but looking at the potential and the need for greater U.S.-China cooperation around climate change is a place where I think we as progressives and people that are very critical of the increasingly hawkish turn towards China can start to make some headway within U.S. policy in particularly pushing the U.S. government to do more to take advantage of the openings that do exist for greater cooperation with the Chinese government. And there are some openings there, notwithstanding the real challenges. I think there's more work to be done in articulating like what a progressive anti-war foreign policy looks like what actually is our vision, and taking on questions like what is the place of principles of human rights and democracy around the world in progressive foreign policy, because right now the hawkish establishment sort of owns that discourse around China, and we need to figure out how do we answer that without sacrificing those principles. Other than that, there's more work that we need to do around promoting counter narratives that can provide alternatives to the dominant narratives that are now being promoted that are feeding escalating conflict. I think some narratives that are really important are to humanize people in China. There's just an overall dehumanization or just invisibilization of the human beings that live in China that I think we need to counter. We also need to promote narratives that can break out of this very stultified nationalistic binary of the US versus China that sets out there's the United States and everything that it represents, and then there's China and everything that it represents, and these are completely opposed and are inevitably going to come into conflict with each other in the world. But we need narratives that can break out of that. Some of the narratives that I think have the most potential here are around labor activists and workers who are critiquing working conditions within China. And there's been a severe crackdown on that in recent years, but there are still people raising these critiques. There are still strikes happening in China. And I think that's a really good place to look at to get people in the US to start to think about what do we have in common with our counterparts in China versus, and that gets people out of this like stark nationalistic framework. And the last thing we need to do is, you mentioned earlier that a lot of the narratives about China are really, really having to do with issues that we have with ourselves in the US. So I think like we need to figure out new narratives just about the US. Like we need to create alternatives to American exceptionalism, which is so central to many Americans' sense of their own identity as Americans. Like if the U.S. isn't the greatest and most powerful country in the world, and if we're not basing our sense of American identity on that, like what is the alternative? I think we do have to provide an alternative. We can't ask people to just give up on that entirely. We need a more progressive alternative. I think another big issue is this nationalistic conflict with China is being used to paper over the growing divides within U.S. society. Like a lot of people across the political spectrum sort of look to it as a solution to increasing polarization. It's like, okay, the country is increasingly polarized. Maybe we can bring everyone together around our shared enemy, which is China. We need a different answer to this breakdown of U.S. society in the sense of increasing polarization. So yeah, that's a lot, but I think those
there's big ambitions and agendas, which I obviously very much support and share, the desire to shift, especially the nationalistic binaries, kind of breaking apart those binaries and building something that's also humanizing one another, not just Chinese, but, individual citizens, but also just all across. And I think that's what the show is also trying to do, is to kind of break out of this nationalistic sort of, coffins that sometimes we're stuck in, and think about ourselves beyond our nations and, beyond nationhood in general. Like, what does that look like? So very, I think very important ambitions, and also looking at some of these pockets of openings, and they still exist. It's not a completely closed off space. There's still individuals doing really incredible work, I think, in China that some of us are studying or following or reading about. And it's important to keep that in mind, and thinking about China as a very dynamic and still, despite all the restrictions, still, I think, a very exciting place to, in some ways, to engage with, and at the very least to learn more about. So I wanted to turn to Xifan for some of her perspectives. She's been, again, covering China for almost a decade. It's a very long time, and I know she writes really in-depth, incredible stories. She also published a book, and unfortunately it's in German, so I haven't had a chance to really read all her writings, but having spent time together, know how hard she works and how many people she interviews and engages with in China. Her knowledge really is incredible. So I wanted to ask you, in terms of just writing and covering the China stories, right? And with all these restrictions, as you mentioned, many journalists are no longer even able to be based in China. When it comes to American reporters, not that many German reporters are actually based there. So you have this interesting, almost unique perspective of still being there. So what kind of stories do you think we should be, journalists should be writing more about, and we as readers should be demanding more of? What are these China stories you hope to write in the next year or so, or whatever amount of time you plan to be in China for the time being? Any glimpses into your future work or the work you aspire to do would be really exciting to hear.
Yeah, I totally agree with Toby that setting like a narrative to the current coverage, especially like to write more human stories that humanize China, are like very interesting, if not the most interesting thing to do right now to change the direction of our debate. In fact, coming to China, I first started out reporting in China 2011, and back then it was my main motivation not to report about politics or economy, but to really, travel the country to talk to Chinese of all different walks of life, and just to get an understanding of the society. Because in my experience as a journalist, also the stories that resonate with the audience the most. I get the most feedback from readers when I really manage to write a story that people get a glimpse of human life of. So, but unfortunately, I mean, as you can guess, it has become more and more difficult in years. There are two main reasons. One is has to do with the structural changes in journalism, Western journalism overall, or the German, or let's say in the journalism industry, anywhere, no matter which country. First, of course, we have been in a steady financial decline for as long as I can remember, since I started in this job. It's just when I started out 10 years ago, at least in Germany, we still had a lot of weekly and monthly magazines, general interest magazines that would be interested in in-depth features from abroad. So at that time, you could still start out as a freelancer. You probably might still be able to do for American media if it was not for the visa restrictions. But at least within those 10 years, a lot of the magazines that I started to work for in the beginning, they don't exist anymore. And the very few that do exist, they have probably cut their budget by half or even less. So you see much less China stuff in German media in general, because there's less media in general. And the remaining few outlets, as I mentioned before, we only have 1 or 2 correspondents for all of Asia. And because one colleague mentioned a very interesting number that he has even more experience than I do. If he looks at the news for that he uses every day, he said 10 or 15 years ago, it was maybe 80 news, I don't know how to say, 80 news hits a day that flicking through his this agency screen, and now it's 350. So the amount of China news has exploded. But I mean, how to cover this if you're 1 or 2 people here, and how to cover these issues in depth. And then also another reason why it's so difficult to write more stories from in-depth stories from psychological competition, economic decoupling, AUKUS, geostrategic, forming geostrategic line with Belt and Road, and so on. Very abstract, big picture issues that kind of take away our attention from basically what's happening in the society itself. So that is a problem we have to address within media outlets in the West. The second is, as you can guess, is that the Chinese regime has an interest in solidify the nationalist fortress that it has become. And the Chinese regime doesn't have any interest in us writing about the people who are still poor in China, who have may have not benefited from the anti-poverty campaign. They are not interested in us writing about the parallels in feminist activism in China and in the US. So it is when I think about how easy it was to get access 10 years ago in China, it's a day and night difference. It used to be 10 years ago, but that was also the heydays of China's Gilded Age, as we called back then, and people were super towards the outside world. You could go, what I love about China is you go to the countryside and you just show up somewhere. People invite you to their houses. They slaughter their last chicken, and basically they have to tell you everything about their life. Nowadays, when I go to the big countryside, There are cameras everywhere, and sooner than later, maybe half an hour later, the local lady from the propaganda office shows up and asks me what I'm doing, whether she can help me with my reporting, because I'm a stranger there. I probably need some like on the ground assistance with finding interviewees and so on. Then she would be on the phone, like fake calling, fake interviewees, and they're like, "Oh, I'm really sorry. No one, everyone is out today. They're not at home." And so, this is what happens to me a lot during recent reporting trips in the past month. And if you call, for example, in Beijing, or people from whether it is companies, whether it is just like individuals, there is such a sentiment of suspicion, and the government has successfully created this narrative of foreign media trying to smear China, and we have like an evil agenda. And so everyone who's talking to us, even if they might be interested in connecting with foreign media, some people some people do appreciate foreign media. Like I think one colleague told me that when he was in Xinjiang, some random driver came up to him and said, "Oh, it's good." Like he secretly told him, "It's good that you are here. Otherwise, no one would know what's happening in this country." So there are people who do appreciate the foreign media here still, but they are very much afraid of being accused of being a traitor, being watched by cameras, people surveying their WeChat. I try to reach out to people via secure channels, but a lot of people, this is very, very often very complicated to jump the great firewall and install VPN. It's almost impossible these days if you're not very, very tech savvy. So even like reaching out via WeChat endangers potential interviewees. So that has just made my job very, very difficult, almost impossible. So, and for the coming years is very bleak, unfortunately, due to I don't see that the second part, like the Chinese regime loosening up anytime soon, and I also don't see the structural problems within the journalism industry in the West being solved anytime soon.
Oh, Shifan, you're always ending on such a cheerful note, like at least we have the memory of the chicken from the early days, that amazing dinner that we can just smell and taste, this delicious, offerings that's now just turned into surveillance.
There were also like foxes. I had to attend so many rural dinners where I did not know how to tell my host that I'm embarrassed. I know it's like it's an honor to be presented that fox stew, but
but not tonight.
I'm allergic to fox. I would say I'm allergic to fox.
Okay, that's a reasonable explanation. There's some kind of a health issue, So, well, it brings back a lot of memories also, of course, of doing research in China, where a lot more openness was present in the past, and a lot more challenges of just getting access to the most basic information and continuing relationships and doing field work and all of that stuff is something that in academic community we're also debating, and there's a lot of anxiety about even returning to China. So we're lucky to have you joining us from Beijing. The idea of even going back, getting the visas, getting to return to, experience even just that glimpse or whatever is feasible is even hard in terms of traveling. So we're hoping that eventually the doors will open up both ways, but we're wishing all the success and all the luck in continuing to capture those chickens and continuing to maintain some relationships and hopefully open up some stories despite this really, really large crisis and huge shifts that really make it very difficult to work as a journalist, but makes your work ever so important. So we're very lucky to have you there on the ground. And of course, Toby, with his organizing efforts and all the communities he's building here in the US and across with China, we're looking forward to following all your work as well. And thank you so much for coming on this show tonight. It was a wonderful, very in-depth discussion, and I hope we can continue this at another time. Thank you everyone for listening, and come back in a month's time for Masha and the Bears. Thank you.
Thank you so much.